Welcome to the Issues of Life podcast, and today we are continuing our discussion of Rhett and Link's spiritual deconstruction, a really important topic that we're devoting several episodes to. Make sure you go back and check out the first episode of this series if you want to catch up on where we are and listen to how we dealt with some of the foundational questions like, were they ever really saved to begin with?
Now, when Link and Rhett were in church, they both expressed a lot of doubts and a lot of questions and struggles that they had, and they didn't really seem to find places for answers. They didn't really feel like they could ask those kind of doubts and questions to people that are around them. I think even Link said that in his household, the question of whether or not evolution was true was just kind of ignored. We don't talk about that. And then they probably also received answers like, well, we believe it's true, and therefore it's true.
And unfortunately, I think that's the same experience of a lot of people who grew up in church. Not everywhere, that's not always the case, but too often that is the way it works. Now, if you were to listen to or watch the videos of these spiritual deconstructions, you would find some trends here, especially in Rhett's episode. He talks about the doubts about creation, about the inerrancy and infallibility of the Word of God, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Some of those were the things that he dealt with in particular, and which led him to do extensive research over the course of several years and come to very different conclusions than what he had been taught growing up in church. We obviously can't deal with everything to a great extent, but we do want to respond to each of these things to the best of our ability, and we want to deal with today the issue of evolution, because that was the issue that began to crack open his doubts, until eventually that led him to where he is today. So I think that's a really important place for us to start.
And that was also kind of the place where Link came to, and that's what kind of started to crack open his faith, the evolution question. So they gave a lot of support for their claims in the 2 hours or more that they both had. So we want to answer this kind of question. Between evolution and creation, which one has more evidence? Because whichever one has more evidence, well, that's the one that we should believe in.
Yeah, well, the issue is that it's not about who has more evidence. All the evidence is exactly the same. Both creationists and evolutionists, the scientists on both sides of the issue, they have access to the same evidence. We can't go back in time, and actually watch either theory unfold. We don't have that possibility. We have the evidence that's presented to us today. Neither has more. They have the exact same evidence. It's just about how you view that evidence. Evolutionists are going to view it through the lens of atheism, of naturalism. They're going to try to explain everything with science and without God. Whereas believers and creationists are going to view it through the lens of God's existence and taking what they see and viewing it through the lens of what the Bible teaches. So that question in and of itself is confusing and misleading. It's not right to say that evolutionists have more evidence, even though Rhett seemed to claim that the evidence that evolutionists have was, for him, overwhelming. He even went so far as to say that, he didn't want to believe in evolution, but when he started reading the books, the evidence was just overwhelming. But I think that's not necessarily what happened. I think something else happened. I think rather than, wanting to believe in evolution or reading, compelling evidence, I think he no longer wanted to believe certain things about the God that he, up to that point, had believed in. In fact, this is what he says in his episode. Why would I believe in a God who would choose to create that particular world where people have no choice whether or not they're going to be born, but then once they are born, if they don't adopt the correct understanding of God, he will punish them forever? Why believe in that God if I don't have to? I think the problem is he came to a point where he no longer wanted to believe in God anymore. And the Bible addresses that issue. In John chapter 7, Jesus says that whoever will do his will, and the idea is that whoever wants to understand will understand it. There is this idea, according to the Bible, that you have to approach it with faith, with a desire. And anyone who approaches God's word in that way, with a desire to understand it, God will open their eyes to understand it. And I think what happened is he decided he didn't want to believe that anymore. And so he started viewing all the evidence through a different lens than he once had. And now everything began to fit that very particular worldview, which he was now constructing. Now his view of God had been completely warped, and he didn't want to believe in that God anymore. But unfortunately, the idea of God that he was holding to was not the right one to begin with. And I think that has a lot to do with the particular strain of Christianity, even in which he grew up, and we'll probably deal with that in a later episode. But he describes God as being spiteful and unjustly sending people to an eternal hell. That's not the God of the Bible. That's not the God of Christianity. So no, I don't want to believe in that God either. But I don't have to, because that's simply not what the Bible teaches.
Now, we do want to address the arguments that he brought up about evolution, though I'm the first to admit that, again, I don't know everything. I'm not a scientist, and I really respect Rhett and Link for coming out the same way. They said, we don't know this. We're not the experts. Neither am I. But I'm looking at these two specific evidences that he gave in the video, and I'm going to hopefully, present at least some kind of argument for the other side, because he seemed to say, again, that the evidence is overwhelming for the way that he was viewing it. Now, he brought up two things. The first thing he brought up was a fused chromosome in the human genome. So basically, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, so 46 altogether, and apes have 24 pairs, so 48 altogether. And if you look really closely at chromosome 2 in the human DNA, it looks like two chromosomes fused together. So the claim is that two chromosomes fused together sometime about 5-6 million years ago in a common ancestor that we have with apes, and that is the evolution process from them to us. Kind of a missing link there, and that's the way we can look at it. But I don't think that has to be conclusive. I don't think that has to be the only way that we look at it. I think apes and man have a lot of similarities, and I think, though it may be a really simple answer, I think it's a good answer, that we were all created by the same God. And I think if we take care of that even further, if you look at other animals, most vertebrates have the same kind of skeletal structure. Like we have a backbone, we have rib cages, we have things in common with all sorts of other creatures. But apes seem to look the most like us. Why? Well, because God made them for a certain environment that required some similarities with man that no other animal has. Like they have opposable thumbs and they have hands, not only on their hands, but their feet also are able to grab onto branches and vines. And that's because the environment God made them for was particular to their creation. So I don't think that it's outside the box, really, for us to make a conclusion that these things can make sense in a creationist viewpoint. If you believe in God, there's a way to understand these things that doesn't involve blinding yourself to facts or details. The second thing that he brought up was retroviruses. Now, this was interesting. I had never heard of retroviruses before. But what they are strands of RNA that are able to copy themselves into the DNA of the host, into the cells that they are in, and then they can transfer to another cell and continue on. That's how viruses spread. But a retrovirus is able to be passed on to other people. And it can do one of two ways. One that we're familiar with other viruses is called horizontal. So from like one person to another person, or from one being to another being. The other version would be passed down through your family or through your parents. So Rhett, when he looks at this, he says, these retroviruses, they've happened throughout history, and we seem to have retroviruses in our DNA that line up to the exact same point as apes and monkeys. So the conclusion then is, if we have the same retroviruses at the same points in our DNA, then we must be similar. We must come from the same place. However, retroviruses do still to this day pass on from monkeys and apes to humans through that horizontal transition. So it's plausible for us to think, okay, well, if the retroviruses are at the same point in our history and our DNA, is it possible that those retroviruses transferred over to humans in a horizontal transfer instead of passed down like evolution would claim it to be? And I think that it's plausible. Again, I don't know all the details, and if you have more questions about it or more knowledge about it, feel free to write below. Please be respectful. But I'm willing to learn, and we want to answer more questions about that for sure if we can find any resources to help, because we don't know everything. But hopefully that's just kind of a very simplistic explanation of how a creationist, someone who believes in God, can look at these evidences, even the seemingly strong ones that Rhett brought up, and still come away with the understanding, the belief that God exists and that God created the world.
Yeah, it's a great example of what we said about viewing the evidence through a particular lens. Most importantly, we want to make sure that it's understood that there is an alternative. There's a viable alternative to the evidence that evolutionists interpret and then give as their own. You don't have to, as Zach said, in order to be a creationist, turn a blind eye to the facts and to science and to medicine, all those things. That's simply not the case. There are incredible minds out there in the creationist world who have dealt with these issues. We're not those people, but again, we can point you to those resources as needed. But we don't want you to think that because they present a bunch of evidence that then that means there's no evidence for the other side. And hopefully, if nothing else, you've understood the issue of evidence is not one of volume, but of interpretation. And you can interpret the same evidence and come out with a creationist worldview. I think this issue is so important, and obviously it was important in their own spiritual story. And for years, I've been warning people about this issue, that if we don't deal with the evolution issue, it's going to lead to this kind of deconstruction because we're not giving good enough answers. So youth workers, youth pastors, parents, teachers, I'm speaking to you for a moment. We've got to get away from squashing doubt and questions on this issue. We don't need to shy away from these issues because they're fundamental to our faith. And we've got to take the time to educate ourselves so that we can answer these questions when they're brought up. Because if we don't answer the questions, they're going to go outside for the answers, just like Rhett and Link did, and they're going to be drawn away by that. And listen, Satan uses evolution as a great tool, and he has for many years, because it's not just about origins. It's about the existence of God in general. And if you can get young people to believe that there is no creator who made them uniquely, then they can believe that there's no God to whom they are accountable. It's a bigger deal than just scientific data. Where did we come from? It's a huge fundamental issue for Christianity. And so we've got to be willing to answer the questions. And teenagers, be willing to ask those questions, if to no one else, to us. Because we want you to know that the Bible does have viable answers, even for these seemingly difficult scientific conundrums. It's an important issue. Ask your questions. Get the right answers.
So please use the comment section as much as you feel necessary to ask questions, to bring up other points, to pin resources if you have them about this issue. And feel free, again, to continue watching these Rhett and Link videos. We're going to keep on going through the deconstruction, and hopefully every other week or so we're going to put out a few videos so you guys can keep track and maybe find some answers to the same questions that they struggled with. Thanks for watching, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.